The gunshot echoed across the Montana plains, sending a startled flock of birds into the crimson sunset sky as Katherine Blackwell ducked behind an overturned wagon, her heart hammering against her ribs. The year was 1876, and she was alone, stranded, and running out of options as quickly as she was running out of ammunition. "Give it up, lady," a gruff voice called from the tree line. "There ain't nowhere to run." Katherine checked her revolver, 2 bullets left. Not enough to fend off the 3 bandits who had ambushed her wagon an hour ago, killing her driver and stealing her belongings. All except the small leather pouch of gold coins sewn into the hem of her dress. Her fingers trembled as she pushed a strand of auburn hair from her face, smearing dirt across her cheek. "I said I have nothing of value," she shouted back, her voice steadier than she felt. "Just leave me be." Cruel laughter answered her plea. Katherine closed her eyes, calculating her odds. The nearest town was at least 15 miles west, and nightfall was approaching. She could try to make a run for it, but her fine leather boots weren't made for the rugged terrain, and her heavy traveling dress would only slow her down. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her grip her revolver tighter, knuckles white with tension. But instead of coming from the direction of the bandits, these horses approached from the west, at least 3 riders, moving fast. "Looks like we got company, boys," one of the bandits called out. Katherine risked a glance over the edge of the wagon. 3 riders appeared on the horizon, silhouettes against the setting sun. They rode hard toward the scene, rifles drawn. The lead rider fired a warning shot into the air. "That's far enough," a deep voice commanded. "Drop your weapons." The bandits hesitated, then one fired toward the newcomers. The exchange of gunfire that followed was brief but intense. Katherine kept her head down, covering her ears against the deafening sound. When silence fell, she dared not move, unsure who had prevailed. "Madam." The same deep voice, closer now. "Are you hurt?" Katherine slowly raised her head. A tall man stood before her, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, the setting sun at his back. His duster coat was coated with trail dust, and a silver star gleamed on his vest. "I'm unharmed," she managed, still clutching her revolver. He extended a hand, calloused and strong. "Xavier Hawkins, U.S. Marshal. Those men won't be troubling you anymore." Katherine eyed his hand warily before accepting it, allowing him to help her to her feet. "Katherine Blackwell." "I'm grateful for your intervention, Marshal Hawkins." "Call me Zav," he said, his eyes finally visible as he tilted his hat back. They were a striking blue, like the Montana sky at midday, set in a face weathered by sun and wind. A scar ran from his right temple to his cheekbone, but it did nothing to diminish the handsome angles of his face. "What brings a lady like you out here alone?" he asked, his gaze taking in her fine clothes, now torn and dusty. "I wasn't alone until those men attacked my wagon and killed my driver," Katherine replied, straightening her shoulders. "I'm traveling to Helena to claim my inheritance. My uncle passed away last month." Xavier nodded, then gestured to his companions who were securing the bodies of the bandits. "These are my deputies, Frank Miller and Tom Cooper. We're heading back to Silver Creek. It's only 5 miles west of here. You can find lodging there until we can arrange safe passage to Helena." Katherine hesitated. Silver Creek wasn't her destination, but she had little choice. "Thank you, Marshal. I accept your offer." As they prepared to leave, Xavier examined the damaged wagon. "Not much worth salvaging here," he commented, retrieving her trunk from among the wreckage. "Is this yours?" Katherine nodded, relief washing over her. The trunk contained her clothes and personal items not as valuable as the gold coins hidden in her dress, but precious nonetheless. Xavier hoisted the trunk onto his horse. "You can ride with me," he said, extending his hand once more. Katherine hesitated only briefly before accepting. His hands circled her waist as he lifted her effortlessly onto his horse before mounting behind her. The closeness was improper, but given the circumstances, propriety was a luxury she couldn't afford. As they rode toward Silver Creek, Katherine felt the steady rhythm of Xavier's breathing against her back, his arms on either side of her as he held the reins. Despite the trauma of the day, she found herself oddly comforted by his presence. "So what awaits you in Helena?" Xavier asked, his deep voice rumbling close to her ear. My uncle's estate, she replied. He owned a successful mining company. I'm his only living relative. Blackwell Mining, Xavier asked, surprise evident in his voice. Yes, did you know my uncle? Everyone in Montana Territory knows of Edward Blackwell, Xavier replied. His company employs half the men in Helena, Katherine nodded. I haven't seen him since I was a child. He and my father had a falling out years ago. I was surprised to learn he'd left everything to me. That makes you a very wealthy woman, Miss Blackwell, Katherine tensed slightly. Is that why those men attacked me? Did they know who I was? Xavier was quiet for a moment. It's possible news travels fast even in these parts, but don't worry, you're safe now. The town of Silver Creek appeared as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains. It was a small settlement, just one main street lined with wooden buildings. A few horses were hitched outside the saloon, and lanterns glowed in windows, casting warm light onto the dusty street. Xavier led them to a two-story building with a sign that reads Silver Creek Hotel. As they dismounted, Katherine's legs nearly gave way beneath her, the events of the day finally catching up to her. Xavier steadied her with a firm hand. Easy there, he said softly. Let's get you inside. The hotel lobby was modest but clean. A woman in her 50s looked up from behind the desk, her eyes widening at Katherine's disheveled appearance. Martha, this is Miss Blackwell, Xavier said. She was attacked on the road. She'll need a room and perhaps a hot bath. Of course, Marshal, Martha replied, reaching for a key. Room 3 is ready. I'll have hot water sent up right away. Thank you, Katherine murmured, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion. I'll have your trunk brought up, Xavier said, his voice gentle. Get some rest. We can talk more tomorrow. Katherine nodded gratefully. Marshal Hawkins, Xav, thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't arrived when you did. Something flickered in his blue eyes, concern, perhaps, or something deeper. Just doing my job, Miss Blackwell, Katherine, she corrected. Or Kate, if you prefer, a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Kate it is, then. Good night. As Katherine followed Martha upstairs, she couldn't help but glance back at the tall marshal standing in the lobby, his hat now in his hands, revealing thick dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. Their eyes met briefly before she continued up the stairs, an unexpected warmth spreading through her despite the harrowing day. The hot bath Martha arranged was heaven to Katherine's aching body. As she soaked in the copper tub, she considered her situation. The attack today was troubling. If those men had targeted her specifically because of her inheritance, who else might be planning similar attempts? And how had word spread so quickly about her arrival? She would need to be more cautious. Perhaps hiring additional protection for the remainder of her journey to Helena would be wise. The marshal and his deputies seemed capable enough. After dressing in a clean nightgown from her trunk, Katherine slid between the crisp sheets of the bed. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the bandits, heard the gunshots. Eventually, she drifted into a fitful sleep, dreaming of blue eyes and strong hands pulling her from danger. Morning arrived with golden sunlight streaming through the thin curtains. Katherine dressed in one of her simpler traveling dresses, a deep green that complemented her auburn hair. Her other gowns were too formal for a place like Silver Creek. Downstairs, the small dining room was nearly empty except for Xavier, who sat alone at a corner table, a cup of coffee before him. He rose when he saw her. Miss Blackwell, he greeted her, pulling out a chair. I trust you slept well. As well as could be expected, she replied, taking the offered seat. And please, it's Katherine or Kate, he nodded, a slight smile warming his features. Kate, then. Martha appeared with a pot of coffee and a plate of eggs and bacon for Katherine. Eat up, dear. You look like you could use a hearty meal. Thank you, Katherine said, suddenly aware of her hunger. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. As she ate, Xavier explained that he had sent a telegram to Helena, informing the authorities there of her situation and expected arrival. I've been thinking, Katherine said between bites. Perhaps I should hire protection for the remainder of my journey. Those men yesterday, if they knew who I was. Xavier leaned forward, his expression serious. I've been considering the same thing. The stagecoach to Helena leaves tomorrow morning. I can arrange for one of my deputies to accompany you. Actually, Katherine said, meeting his gaze directly, I was hoping you might consider escorting me yourself, Marshal. I would compensate you fairly, of course. Xavier seemed surprised by her request. I have responsibilities here in Silver Creek. Surely your deputies can manage for a few days, she pressed. I would feel safer with you. The admission cost her some pride, but it was the truth. Something about Xavier Hawkins made her feel protected in a way she hadn't experienced before. He studied her for a long moment, those blue eyes seeming to look right through her carefully constructed composure. Very well, he finally said. I'll escort you to Helena. We'll leave on tomorrow's stagecoach. Relief washed over Katherine. Thank you. Their breakfast was interrupted by the arrival of a man in a tailored suit, his mustache perfectly waxed and his hat spotless despite the dusty streets outside. Marshal Hawkins, the man said, his voice smooth as polished silver. I heard we had an incident on the road yesterday. Xavier nodded, his expression cooling noticeably. Mayor Prescott, this is Miss Katherine Blackwell. Kate, this is Mayor Joseph Prescott. The mayor's eyes widened slightly at her name. Blackwell, any relation to Edward Blackwell of Helena? His niece, Katherine replied, instantly wary of the gleam that appeared in the mayor's eyes. How extraordinary, and what brings Edward Blackwell's niece to our humble Silver Creek? Before Katherine could answer, Xavier intervened. Miss Blackwell was attacked on her way to Helena. She's resting here before continuing her journey. Attacked? How dreadful, Prescott said, though his tone lacked genuine concern. You must allow me to host a small dinner in your honor tonight, Miss Blackwell. It's not often we have such distinguished visitors. Katherine glanced at Xavier, who gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. That's very kind, Mayor Prescott, she said carefully, but I'm still quite shaken from yesterday's events. I think a quiet evening would be best. Disappointment flashed across the mayor's face before his practiced smile returned. Of course, perhaps another time. Safe travels to Helena, Miss Blackwell. Your uncle was a great man, a visionary. After Prescott departed, Katherine raised an eyebrow at Xavier. You don't trust him. Prescott has ambitions that extend beyond Silver Creek, Xavier replied, keeping his voice low. He's been trying to secure investors for a railway line through town. Your uncle refused to back him. And now he thinks I might be more amenable, Xavier nodded. Just be careful. Prescott isn't the only one who'll see you as Edward Blackwell's fortune rather than his niece. The rest of the day passed quietly. Katherine purchased a few necessities from the general store and wrote letters to her friends back east, explaining her delay. Xavier was often visible from her hotel window, patrolling the street or speaking with townspeople. Several times their eyes met when he glanced up at her window, and each time Katherine felt a peculiar flutter in her chest. That evening, a knock at her door revealed Xavier with a covered dinner tray. Martha thought you might prefer to eat in your room, he explained. That was thoughtful of her, Katherine said, accepting the tray. Would you care to join me? I've been alone with my thoughts all day. Xavier hesitated, then nodded. Let me fetch my own plate. I'll return shortly. When he returned, they sat at the small table near the window. Katherine had lit the lamps, casting a warm glow throughout the room. The impropriety of dining alone with a man in her hotel room wasn't lost on her, but conventional rules seemed less important after facing death just a day earlier. Tell me about yourself, Marshal Hawkins, Katherine said as they ate. How does a man like you end up in Silver Creek? Xavier took a sip of water before answering. I grew up in Colorado. My father was a rancher. After the war, I drifted north, worked as a ranch hand, then a bounty hunter. Been the marshal here for 3 years now. The war? Katherine asked gently. Union cavalry, he replied, his expression closing slightly. Not something I care to revisit. Katherine nodded, understanding. Many men who had fought carried invisible scars. And is there a Mrs. Hawkins waiting for you somewhere? A sad smile touched his lips. There was, long ago. She died of fever while I was away fighting. I'm sorry, Katherine said sincerely. That must have been devastating. It was, he acknowledged. But that was another life. What about you? No husband back east, Katherine shook her head. I was engaged once to a banker my father approved of, but I discovered he was more interested in my family's connections than in me. I broke it off. That took courage, Xavier observed. Or foolishness, according to my father, Katherine replied with a wry smile. He hasn't quite forgiven me yet. Their conversation flowed easily after that, moving from their pasts to books they'd read, places they'd visited. Katherine found herself laughing more than she had in months, drawn to Xavier's quiet intelligence and dry humor. As the evening wore on, Katherine moved to the window, gazing up at the vast Montana sky, brilliant with stars. "It's beautiful here," she said softly. "So different from Boston." Xavier joined her at the window, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Montana has a way of getting under your skin," he agreed, "makes everywhere else seem too crowded, too confined." "I can see why my uncle loved it," Katherine murmured. Their eyes met in the lamplight, and for a breathless moment, Katherine thought Xavier might move closer. Instead, he stepped back, breaking the spell. "I should let you rest," he said, his voice rougher than before. "The stagecoach leaves early tomorrow." "Of course," Katherine replied, trying to hide her disappointment. "Thank you for the company, Xav." He paused at her use of his shortened name, something flickering in his eyes. "Good night, Kate," he said softly before leaving. Katherine stood at the window long after he'd gone, watching as he crossed the street to the marshal's office, wondering at the strange pull she felt toward a man she'd known for only a day. The stagecoach journey began at dawn the next morning. Katherine wore her practical traveling dress and a bonnet to shield her face from the sun. Xavier had secured them seats on the twice-weekly coach to Helena, a journey that would take nearly 2 days with an overnight stop in a settlement called Elk Ridge. Xavier helped Katherine board, then took the seat beside her. 2 other passengers joined them, a salesman with a case of patent medicines and an elderly woman returning to Helena after visiting her daughter. As the coach lurched forward, Katherine found herself pressed against Xavier's side. "Sorry," she murmured, attempting to maintain a proper distance on the narrow seat. "No need to apologize," he replied, his voice low. "These coaches weren't built for comfort." The journey was indeed uncomfortable. The roads were rough and dust seeped through every crack in the coach. By midday, Katherine's fine clothing was coated in a layer of dirt and her back ached from the constant jolting. During a brief stop to change horses, Xavier helped Katherine down from the coach. "How are you holding up?" he asked, genuine concern in his eyes. "I'll survive," she replied with a smile, "though I'm gaining a new appreciation for the comforts of rail travel." "The railway doesn't reach everywhere yet," Xavier said, handing her a canteen of water. "Sometimes the old ways are still necessary." As Katherine drank, she noticed Xavier scanning their surroundings, his hand never far from his holstered pistol. "Are you expecting trouble?" she asked quietly. "Just being cautious," he replied. "The attack on your wagon wasn't random, Kate. Someone knew you were coming." Katherine's stomach tightened with anxiety. "Do you think they'll try again?" "I think anyone after Edward Blackwell's fortune wouldn't be deterred by one failed attempt," he said frankly. "But don't worry, I won't let anything happen to you." The simple declaration shouldn't have comforted her as much as it did. Katherine had never been one to depend on others for protection. Growing up in Boston society, she'd learned to defend herself with words and wit rather than strength. But out here in this wild country, different rules applied. "I believe you," she said softly. Their eyes held for a long moment before the driver called for passengers to reboard. As they continued their journey, Katherine found herself studying Xavier's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the slight crease between his brows as he watched the passing landscape. He was unlike any man she'd known in Boston, where gentlemen wore tailored suits and discussed politics over brandy. Xavier Hawkins was a man shaped by this untamed land, as solid and dependable as the mountains themselves. The stagecoach arrived at Elk Ridge as the sun was setting. It was even smaller than Silver Creek, just a handful of buildings clustered around the stagecoach stop. The only accommodation was a rustic inn above the town's sole restaurant. "It's not much," Xavier apologized as he helped Katherine down from the coach, but it's just for one night. It will do fine, she assured him, stretching her cramped muscles. The innkeeper, a brusque woman named Mrs. Larson, informed them that due to an unexpected group of miners passing through, they had only one room available. I can sleep in the stables, Xavier offered immediately. Nonsense, Mrs. Larson interjected. Rooms got 2 beds. Times like these, formalities ain't worth much. Unless the lady objects, Katherine hesitated only briefly. The thought of being alone in a strange place still unnerved her after the attack. I have no objection, provided there are indeed 2 beds. Xavier looked surprised but nodded. If you're certain. After a simple but filling dinner of venison stew and cornbread, they retired to their room. It was small but clean, with 2 narrow beds separated by a wooden nightstand. A privacy screen stood in one corner beside a wash basin. I'll step out while you prepare for bed, Xavier said, clearly uncomfortable despite the practical arrangement. When he returned, Katherine was already in one of the beds, covered to her chin with the quilt. She had changed into her nightgown behind the screen and let her hair down, the auburn waves cascading over her shoulders. Xavier removed his boots and gunbelt but remained fully clothed as he lay on the other bed, his back to her. "Good night, Kate," he said, his voice gruff. "Good night, Xav," she replied softly. Despite her exhaustion, Katherine found sleep elusive. She was acutely aware of Xavier's presence just a few feet away, the sound of his steady breathing in the darkness. What was it about this man that affected her so? She'd known him for merely 2 days, yet she felt connected to him in a way she couldn't explain. "Xav," she whispered, unsure if he was still awake. "May I ask you something?" He rolled over to face her, moonlight from the small window illuminating his features. "What is it?" "Why did you agree to escort me to Helena? Surely your deputies could have handled it." Xavier was quiet for so long that Katherine thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "I'm not entirely sure. Something about you. I felt responsible for your safety, more than just as a marshal." The honesty of his answer made Katherine's heart beat faster. "I'm glad you came," she admitted. "I feel safe with you." Another long silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken words. "We should sleep," Xavier finally said. "Tomorrow will be another long day." "Yes," Katherine agreed, though sleep seemed further away than ever. "Good night, then." She closed her eyes, trying to ignore the awareness of him so close yet impossibly distant. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and she drifted into dreams filled with blue eyes and strong hands. Morning came too soon, with Mrs. Larson knocking loudly to announce breakfast was ready. Katherine dressed quickly behind the screen while Xavier waited outside the room. When she emerged, he was standing in the hallway, freshly shaved and looking more rested than she felt. "Sleep well?" he asked, his eyes taking in her appearance with a warmth that made her blush. "Well enough," she lied, acutely conscious of the dark circles under her eyes that her hasty application of rice powder hadn't quite concealed. After a breakfast of eggs and flapjacks, they boarded the stagecoach for the final leg of their journey. The day was cooler than the previous one, with clouds gathering on the horizon promising rain. "We should reach Helena by mid-afternoon," Xavier said as they settled into their seats. The salesman and elderly woman had continued on to other destinations, leaving them alone in the coach. "And then what happens?" Katherine asked, voicing the question that had kept her awake much of the night. Xavier gave her a questioning look. "You claim your inheritance, I suppose." "No, I meant, with us," she clarified, her cheeks warming. "Will you return to Silver Creek immediately?" Something flickered in his eyes, regret, perhaps, or longing. "I should. I've been away from my post for too long already." "Of course," Katherine said, looking away to hide her disappointment. "You've been very kind to escort me this far." Xavier hesitated, then reached across the space between them to take her hand. His touch sent a jolt through Katherine's body. "Kate," he began, his voice low and serious. The coach lurched violently, cutting off his words. A gunshot cracked through the air, followed by the driver's shout of alarm. "Get down," Xavier commanded, pushing Katherine to the floor of the coach as more shots rang out. He drew his pistol and peered cautiously out the window. "What's happening?" Katherine asked, her heart pounding with fear. "Ambush," Xavier replied grimly. "3 riders, maybe 4. The coach was slowing as the driver fought to control the frightened horses. Xavier opened the door a crack. "Stay here," he ordered before slipping out, using the coach for cover as he returned fire. Katherine huddled on the floor, her mind racing. This was no random attack, it had to be connected to her inheritance. Someone was determined to prevent her from reaching Helena. More gunshots echoed outside, followed by a cry of pain. Katherine couldn't tell if it was Xavier or one of the attackers. Unable to bear the uncertainty, she crawled to the door and peered out. Xavier was crouched behind the coach wheel, exchanging fire with 2 men on horseback. A third lay motionless on the ground. The driver was slumped on his seat, blood staining his shirt. As Katherine watched in horror, one of the attackers circled behind the coach, aiming directly at Xavier's exposed back. Without thinking, Katherine reached for the small derringer she kept hidden in her reticule, a precaution her father had insisted upon when she traveled. She'd never fired it before, but desperation guided her hand as she aimed and pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, but it was enough to startle the attacker and alert Xavier to the danger. He spun around, firing twice in rapid succession. The man fell from his horse with a cry. The last attacker, seeing his companions down, turned his horse and fled. Xavier fired after him but missed as the rider disappeared around a bend in the road. Katherine stumbled from the coach on shaky legs. "Xav, are you hurt?" He turned to her, his face grim but uninjured. "I'm fine. You shouldn't have exposed yourself like that." "He was going to shoot you in the back," Katherine replied, her voice trembling. "I couldn't just watch." Xavier's expression softened. He reached out to touch her cheek gently. "Thank you," he said simply. They turned their attention to the driver, who was still alive but badly wounded. "We need to get him to Helena quickly," Xavier said, examining the man's injury. "Can you drive a team?" Katherine nodded. "My father kept horses. I can manage. Good. I'll tend to him while you drive. We're only about an hour from Helena if we push the horses." Together, they made the injured driver as comfortable as possible in the coach. Xavier climbed in with him to keep pressure on the wound, while Katherine took the driver's seat. The horses were nervous after the gunfire, but Katherine spoke soothingly to them as she took up the reins. "Heya," she called, snapping the reins. The coach lurched forward, beginning the final stretch to Helena. As they traveled, Katherine's mind whirled with questions. Who wanted her dead? Who stood to gain if she never claimed her inheritance? And what had Xavier been about to say before the attack interrupted them? The sight of Helena on the horizon brought relief flooding through her. It was larger than she'd expected, a proper city with brick buildings and wooden sidewalks, bustling with activity even in the afternoon hours. Xavier directed her to the doctor's office, where they delivered the wounded driver. Then he escorted her to the sheriff's office to report the attacks. Sheriff Collins, a burly man with a thick gray mustache, listened intently to their account. "Marshal Hawkins," he said when they finished, "your reputation precedes you. We're grateful for your protection of Miss Blackwell." "Just doing my duty," Xavier replied modestly. "And Miss Blackwell," the sheriff continued, "your uncle was a respected man in this community. He'd be troubled to hear of these attempts on your life. Do you have any idea who might be behind them?" Katherine asked. The sheriff exchanged a look with Xavier. "I have my suspicions," he said carefully. "Your uncle had rivals in the mining business. Some weren't happy about his success or his methods." "Methods?" Katherine questioned. "Edward Blackwell was fair to his workers," Sheriff Collins explained. "Paid better wages than most, invested in safety measures. It cut into profits, but he said it was the right thing to do." "Not everyone in the business shares that philosophy." "I need to speak with my uncle's lawyer," Katherine said decisively. "Perhaps the terms of his will might shed light on who stands to gain from my death." "I'll escort you there now," Xavier offered. "Where will Miss Blackwell be staying?" He asked the sheriff. "The Montana Hotel is the finest in town," Collins replied. "I'll send a deputy to secure rooms and watch over her." Katherine wanted to protest that she needed no watching over, but the events of the past days had proven otherwise. "Thank you, Sheriff." They left the sheriff's office and walked down Helena's main street toward the offices of Patterson and Watson, attorneys at law. Katherine was acutely aware of Xavier beside her, his presence both reassuring and unsettling. Their time together was drawing to a close, and the thought filled her with an unexpected sadness. "What will you do after this?" she asked quietly as they walked. "Return to Silver Creek," Xavier nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's my duty." "Of course," Katherine said, trying to keep disappointment from her voice. "I appreciate everything you've done, Marshal Hawkins." He stopped walking, turning to face her. "Kate," he said, his voice low and serious, "what I was trying to say in the coach before the attack." Katherine's heart quickened. "Yes." Before he could continue, a voice called out, "Marshal Hawkins, Miss Blackwell." They turned to see a man hurrying toward them, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. "I'm James Patterson, your uncle's attorney," he introduced himself, shaking their hands. "Sheriff Collins sent word you were coming. Please, my office is just ahead." The moment between them broken, Katherine and Xavier followed Patterson to his office. Inside, the lawyer offered them seats before a large desk covered with neat stacks of papers. "Miss Blackwell, first let me express my condolences for your uncle's passing," Patterson began. "He spoke of you often and with great affection." "Thank you," Katherine replied, surprised, "though I must admit we weren't close. I hadn't seen him since I was a child." "Nevertheless, he kept track of your life through correspondence in Boston," Patterson explained. "He was quite proud of your accomplishments, particularly your work with the Women's Suffrage Association." Katherine blinked in surprise. She had indeed been involved with the suffragists in Boston, much to her father's dismay. How had her uncle known? As to the matter of his will, Patterson continued, retrieving a document from his desk, "It's quite straightforward. Edward Blackwell has left you his entire estate, including the mining company, his investments, and his personal property. The estate is valued at approximately $300,000. Katherine gasped softly. She had expected an inheritance, but not one of this magnitude. Beside her, Xavier shifted in his chair. "There is one condition," Patterson added, scanning the document. "You must reside in Helena and personally oversee the mining company for a minimum of 1 year before taking full control of the assets. During that year, you will receive a generous allowance, but the bulk of the inheritance remains in trust." "Why would he stipulate that?" Katherine asked, puzzled. "Your uncle believed in hands-on management," Patterson explained. "He wanted his successor to understand the business from the inside, to know the miners and their families personally. He believed that was the only way to run the company with the integrity he valued." Katherine considered this. A year in Helena, far from Boston society and her father's influence. A year to learn a business she knew nothing about. It was daunting, yet strangely appealing. "There's more," Patterson continued. "Your uncle was aware his business practices created enemies. He anticipated that his death might put his heir in danger." The lawyer glanced at Xavier. "He made provisions for your protection during the transition period." "What kind of provisions?" Xavier asked, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the office. Patterson smiled slightly. "He left funds specifically to hire a personal security detail for Miss Blackwell, preferably someone with law enforcement experience. The position pays handsomely and includes accommodations in the guest house on Mr. Blackwell's property." Katherine and Xavier exchanged startled glances. "It seems your uncle thought of everything, Miss Blackwell," Patterson said, closing the document. "Do you accept these terms?" Katherine took a deep breath. "I do," she said firmly. Then, turning to Xavier, she added, "But the matter of security is my decision, correct?" Patterson nodded. "Of course, your uncle merely made the suggestion and provided the funds." "Then I would like to offer the position to Marshal Hawkins," Katherine said, looking directly at Xavier, "if he's willing to consider it." Xavier's blue eyes widened in surprise. "Miss Blackwell, Kate, I have responsibilities in Silver Creek." "I understand," she said quickly. "It was merely a suggestion. You've already done more than enough." Patterson cleared his throat. "Perhaps you should at least see the property before making any decisions," he suggested. "I can take you there now if you'd like." "Thank you, Mr. Patterson," Katherine replied. That would be most helpful. They left the attorney's office and boarded Patterson's carriage for the short ride to Edward Blackwell's estate. As they traveled, Katherine's mind raced with the implications of her inheritance and the year ahead. And beneath those practical concerns, the unsettling awareness of Xavier beside her, their future paths still unclear. Edward Blackwell's estate lay on the outskirts of Helena, set against the backdrop of the mountains. The main house was a stately two-story structure built of local stone and timber, with wide verandas and tall windows. Nearby stood the promised guest house, smaller but no less well constructed. "Your uncle built this place 10 years ago," Patterson explained as they approached. He wanted something that blended with the Montana landscape rather than standing apart from it. Katherine immediately understood what he meant. Unlike the ostentatious mansions of Boston's elite, this home seemed to belong to its surroundings, as natural as the mountains behind it. Inside, the house was comfortably furnished with a blend of local craftsmanship and imported luxuries. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, and bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes on mining, geology, and, surprisingly, poetry. "Your uncle's personal effects are as he left them," Patterson said. "He wanted you to have a sense of the man he became after leaving the East." Katherine wandered the rooms, touching objects her uncle had handled, reading titles of books he had read. It was like meeting him as an adult for the first time, discovering the person he'd been beyond her childhood memories. In his study, a portrait caught her eye, a young woman with auburn hair similar to her own. "Who is this?" she asked Patterson. "Your mother," the lawyer replied softly. "Edward kept it on his desk always. The rift with your father never extended to his feelings for his sister." Katherine felt tears prick her eyes. Her mother had died when she was 14, and her father rarely spoke of her afterward. To find this connection to her here in this place so far from home seemed like a message across time. "And this," Patterson continued, opening a drawer in the desk, "he wanted you to have immediately." He handed Katherine a small wooden box. Inside lay a pendant on a silver chain, a star-shaped sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "It was your grandmother's," Patterson explained. "Edward left a letter explaining its significance, which you'll find inside the box." Katherine nodded, carefully closing the box and placing it in her reticule. She would read the letter in private. They toured the rest of the house, then moved to the guest house, which was comfortably appointed with its own kitchen, sitting room, and 2 bedrooms. "This would be the security details quarters," Patterson explained. "Close enough to respond quickly if needed, but providing privacy for both parties." Throughout the tour, Xavier had remained largely silent, taking in everything with his observant gaze. Now, standing in the guest house, Katherine could see him assessing sight lines, defensible positions, escape routes, the instincts of a lawman never far from the surface. "What do you think?" she asked him quietly as Patterson stepped outside to speak with the caretaker. Xavier met her eyes directly. "It's a fine property. Your uncle built something to be proud of." "I meant about the security position," Katherine clarified, though she suspected he knew that. Xavier sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "Kate, I've been Silver Creek's marshal for 3 years. I have responsibilities there, people who depend on me." "I understand," she said, trying to hide her disappointment. "It was presumptuous of me to suggest it." "No," he said quickly, "it's not that, it's just—" He hesitated, then continued more softly. "Being near you is complicated for me." Katherine's heart quickened at his words. "Complicated how?" Before he could answer, Patterson returned. "The caretaker will prepare the main house for your immediate occupancy, Miss Blackwell. You can move in tonight if you wish." "Thank you, Mr. Patterson," Katherine replied, reluctantly turning from Xavier. "That would be perfect." They returned to town to collect Katherine's trunk from the stagecoach office and settle affairs with the sheriff. Sheriff Collins promised to investigate the attacks and post a deputy at the Blackwell estate until more permanent security arrangements could be made. As evening approached, Patterson's carriage delivered them back to the estate. The main house was lit with lamps, and a fire crackled in the stone fireplace. The caretaker, Mrs. Henderson, had prepared a simple dinner that awaited them in the dining room. "Will Marshal Hawkins be staying in the guest house tonight, Mrs. Henderson asked as she showed Katherine to the master suite. Katherine glanced at Xavier, who stood awkwardly in the hallway. I'm not sure," she admitted. "I'll prepare it just in case," the older woman said with a knowing smile that made Katherine blush. After Mrs. Henderson departed, Katherine turned to Xavier. "Will you at least stay for dinner? We never got to finish our conversation earlier." Xavier nodded, his blue eyes intense in the lamp light. "I'd like that." Dinner was a quiet affair, both of them acutely aware of unspoken words hanging between them. When they finished, Katherine suggested they move to the veranda, where the evening air was cool and fragrant with pine. They sat in adjacent rocking chairs, the vast Montana sky spread above them, stars beginning to appear as darkness fell. "I've been thinking about your uncle's security provision," Xavier said finally. "It makes sense, given the attempts on your life. Whoever is behind them won't simply give up because you've reached Helena." "I agree," Katherine replied, watching him carefully. "But as you said, you have responsibilities in Silver Creek." Xavier was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the darkening mountains. "I've been marshal there for 3 years," he said slowly. "Perhaps it's time for a change." Hope fluttered in Katherine's chest, but she tried to keep her voice steady. "What are you saying, Xav?" He turned to her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. "I'm saying I'd like to accept the position if the offer still stands, not just because it's a good opportunity or because you need protection." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But because the thought of returning to Silver Creek while you're here in Helena, it doesn't sit right with me." Katherine's heart raced. "Why not?" she pressed gently. Xavier stood, moving to the veranda railing, his back to her. "Because in the few days I've known you, Kate Blackwell, you've awakened something in me I thought was long dead, something I buried alongside my wife years ago." Katherine rose, moving to stand beside him. "And what is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned to her, his blue eyes intense in the gathering darkness. "Hope," he said simply, "the kind that makes a man think about tomorrow instead of just surviving today." Katherine's breath caught in her throat. "Xav, I know it's too soon," he continued quickly. "We barely know each other, and you have your inheritance to manage, a new life to build here. The last thing you need is a rough Montana lawman complicating matters." "What if that's exactly what I need?" Katherine asked, finding courage in his honesty. "These past days with you have been the most alive I've felt in years. In Boston, I was just going through the motions, living the life my father expected. Here with you." She hesitated, then reached for his hand. "I feel like I've found something I didn't even know I was looking for." Xavier's fingers tightened around hers. "Kate," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion, "I can't offer you the life you're accustomed to." "I don't want that life," she said firmly. "I want this one, the one my uncle built, the one he wanted me to experience, and she paused, gathering her courage. "I want you in it, Xav, as my security, yes, but also as more than that in time." His free hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle despite the calluses on his palm. "Are you sure about this, about me?" Katherine leaned into his touch, her heart full to bursting. "I've never been more certain of anything." Slowly, giving her time to pull away, Xavier leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but deepened as Katherine responded, her arms sliding around his neck. When they finally parted, both breathless, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I'll need to return to Silver Creek briefly," he said, "to resign properly and train my replacement." "Of course," Katherine agreed, "and I'll need to learn about running a mining company." "We'll figure it out together," Xavier promised, his arms tightening around her waist. They stood on the veranda as night fully descended, the stars brilliant in the clear Montana sky. Katherine felt as though she stood on the edge of a new life, one filled with challenges certainly, but also with possibilities she had never imagined in Boston. "You know," she said softly, leaning against Xavier's solid warmth, "when I left Boston, my father warned me that this was foolishness. He said I'd forget all about my Eastern life once I tasted Western freedom. And was he right? Xavier asked, his breath warm against her hair. Katherine smiled, remembering something else: the pendant in the wooden box and the letter she had read while preparing for dinner. Her grandmother's star sapphire, passed down through generations of Blackwell women, a symbol of enduring love. I told him I wouldn't, she replied, looking up into Xavier's blue eyes, and he said you'll forget me someday, as if it were inevitable that I'd never return east. Xavier brushed a strand of hair from her face. And what did you say to that? Katherine's smile deepened as she recalled her own words, spoken in defiance but now holding new meaning. I told him I wouldn't forget, not until the stars fade from the sky. Xavier gazed up at the brilliant canopy above them, then back to her face. That's a very long time, Kate Blackwell. Yes, she agreed, her heart full. It is. 6 months later, Katherine stood at the entrance of the Blackwell mine, watching as workers emerged from their shift. She knew many by name, now a point of pride for her as she learned the business her uncle had built. The mining operation was larger than she had initially realized, employing over 200 men and supporting countless families in Helena and the surrounding areas. Edward Blackwell had indeed built his company on principles of fair treatment and safety, making him beloved by his workers even as his competitors resented his success. Those competitors had become Katherine's primary concern in recent months. After Xavier's investigation, with help from Sheriff Collins, they had traced the attacks on her to Gregory Wellington, owner of the rival Wellington Mining Company. Wellington had hoped to acquire Blackwell's operation after Edward's death and had been incensed to learn of Katherine's inheritance. With evidence provided by one of the captured attackers, Wellington now awaited trial for conspiracy to commit murder. His mining operation had been placed under court supervision, its practices scrutinized and found wanting in numerous safety aspects. Miss Blackwell. A voice called, drawing Katherine from her thoughts. It was Thomas Johnson, her mine foreman, approaching with a broad smile. The new support timbers are in place in the east tunnel, just like you specified. Excellent, Mr. Johnson, Katherine replied, and the ventilation improvements. Coming along nicely. The men are breathing easier already. Johnson shook his head admiringly. Your uncle would be proud. Not many owners, especially not a lady from back east, would invest so much in safety measures before expanding operations. My uncle understood that the men are the true wealth of this company, Katherine said, repeating words she'd found in Edward's journals. The gold and silver are worthless if we lose lives extracting them. Johnson nodded approvingly. That's what made him different. And you're carrying on that tradition fine. As Johnson departed, Katherine felt a familiar presence behind her. She turned to find Xavier watching her, pride evident in his blue eyes. Supervising the shift change again, he asked, moving to her side. I like to see the men come up safely, she admitted. It helps me sleep better knowing they're returning to their families. Xavier took her gloved hand in his, an easy gesture that still sent warmth through her body. In the months since he had accepted the security position, their relationship had deepened beyond either's expectations. Xavier had indeed returned to Silver Creek to resign and train his deputy to take over as marshal. When he returned to Helena 2 weeks later, he moved into the guest house as planned, but the professional boundaries they had initially established quickly blurred. Their evenings were spent together, talking long into the night about their pasts, their hopes, their growing feelings for each other. Katherine had never felt so understood by anyone. Xavier confessed the same. Now, as summer turned to fall in the Montana Territory, they had settled into a comfortable routine that defied conventional propriety but felt entirely right to them both. I've received a letter from my father, Katherine said as they walked back toward the main house. He's finally realized I'm not returning to Boston anytime soon. Is he still upset? Xavier asked. Katherine's father had initially responded to her decision to remain in Montana with anger and threats to disown her, certain this Western adventure was a passing fancy. He's coming to terms with it, Katherine replied. In fact, he's hinted he might visit next spring to see this mining operation for himself. Xavier raised an eyebrow, and to meet the former marshal who's courting his daughter, Katherine smiled, squeezing his hand. That too, I suspect. The word courting was accurate if understated. Though Xavier still maintained his quarters in the guest house for propriety's sake, Katherine was, after all, a lady of standing in Helena now. They both knew their relationship had progressed beyond conventional courtship. They reached the house as evening was falling, the mountains painted in purple and gold by the setting sun. Mrs. Henderson had prepared supper, leaving it warming by the stove before departing for her own cottage on the property. After eating, they settled in the study, where a fire chased away the autumn chill. This had become their favorite room, surrounded by Edward Blackwell's books and the evidence of the man who had inadvertently brought them together. Xavier sat in the leather chair by the fire, watching as Katherine reviewed ledgers from the mine. She had taken to the business with surprising aptitude, her Eastern education and natural intelligence allowing her to quickly understand the operation's complexities. "You're staring," she noted without looking up, a smile playing at her lips. "Just admiring the view," he replied unapologetically. Katherine set aside the ledger and moved to perch on the arm of his chair. "And what do you see?" Xavier reached up to tuck a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "A remarkable woman who belongs here more than she ever realized. It does feel like home now," Katherine admitted, "more than Boston ever did." "Is that because of the place or the company?" Xavier asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. Katherine leaned down to kiss him softly. "Both," she whispered against his lips, "but mostly the company." Xavier pulled her onto his lap, his arms encircling her waist. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice suddenly earnest. "That sounds dangerous," Katherine teased, though her heart quickened at his expression. "Very," he agreed with a smile that quickly faded to seriousness. "Kate, these past months with you, they've been the happiest of my life. I never expected to find this kind of happiness again after losing my wife." Katherine touched his face gently. "Nor I, after giving up on finding a man who valued me for more than my family name or my dowry." Xavier caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I want to build a life with you, Kate, not as your security, not as a guest in your home, but as your husband, if you'll have me." Though she had suspected this conversation was coming, the reality of it still took Katherine's breath away. "Are you proposing, Marshal Hawkins?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I am," he confirmed, reaching into his pocket, "and I have this to make it official." He produced a small velvet box. Opening it revealed a ring with a modestly sized diamond flanked by 2 sapphires. "The sapphires reminded me of your grandmother's pendant," Xavier explained, "and of that night on the veranda when you talked about stars that never fade." Tears welled in Katherine's eyes as she remembered that moment, their first kiss, the beginning of this unexpected journey together. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Katherine Blackwell," Xavier said formally, "will you marry me? Will you build a life with me here in Montana, running your uncle's mine and maybe someday raising a family in this house he built?" "Yes," Katherine replied without hesitation. "Yes to all of it, Xav." He slid the ring onto her finger, then pulled her close for a kiss that promised a lifetime of tomorrows. Later, they stood on the veranda as they often did in the evenings, gazing up at the star-filled Montana sky. Katherine's head rested against Xavier's shoulder, her left hand extended slightly so the ring could catch the starlight. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "when my father said I would forget him and my life in Boston, and I replied not until the stars fade, I never imagined how prophetic those words would be." Xavier's arm tightened around her waist. "How so?" Katherine turned in his embrace to face him. "Because now I have my own promise to make. I will love you, Xavier Hawkins, not until the stars fade, but far beyond that for as long as my soul exists." Xavier's blue eyes, so like the Montana sky at midday, shone with emotion as he bent to kiss her again. "And I will love you just as long, Kate." That's a promise sealed by those same stars. As they held each other under the vast canopy of stars, Katherine knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in the house her uncle had built, not even in the beautiful Montana territory, but in the arms of a man who had rescued her on a dusty road, and then, more importantly, had awakened her heart to possibilities she had never dared to dream. Spring came to Montana in a riot of wildflowers and fresh green growth. The mountains shed their snow caps gradually, feeding the streams that rushed through the valleys. On the Blackwell property, the apple trees Edward had planted years ago burst into fragrant bloom, creating a natural cathedral for the wedding that took place beneath their branches. Katherine wore a gown of ivory silk, simpler than what would have been expected in Boston society but perfect for this place and this moment. Her auburn hair was adorned with tiny white flowers, and around her neck hung her grandmother's star sapphire pendant, complementing the ring on her finger. Xavier waited for her beneath the largest apple tree, looking uncharacteristically nervous in his new black suit. When Katherine appeared, walking alone down the path between rows of seated guests, his face transformed with a smile that outshone the April sun. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, the couple exchanging vows they had written themselves before the local minister. Friends from Helena and Silver Creek witnessed their union, along with the miners and their families who had come to respect the new owner of Blackwell Mining. Katherine's father had indeed made the journey from Boston, arriving a week before the wedding with trunks of gifts and a grudging acceptance of his daughter's new life. After meeting Xavier and seeing Katherine's happiness, his resistance had melted further. By the wedding day, he had given his blessing with surprising warmth. "You were right," he admitted to Katherine the night before the ceremony. "This is where you belong, I see that now." As Xavier placed a simple gold band on Katherine's finger to join her engagement ring, he repeated the promise he had made months earlier. "Not until the stars fade, but far beyond that for as long as my soul exists." Katherine's voice was steady as she made the same vow, sealing it with a kiss that drew cheers from the assembled guests. The celebration continued into the evening, with tables set up on the lawn and lanterns hanging from the trees. There was music and dancing, hearty food and flowing champagne. Katherine danced with her father, then with Sheriff Collins, and finally returned to her new husband's arms as the night deepened and stars appeared above them. "Happy, Mrs. Hawkins?" Xavier asked, holding her close as they swayed to the music. "Completely," she replied, savoring the sound of her new name. Though she would remain Katherine Blackwell for business purposes, in her personal life she had proudly taken Xavier's surname. As the celebration wound down and guests began to depart, Katherine and Xavier stood on the veranda of what was now their home, accepting final congratulations and well wishes. "You two are good for each other," Sheriff Collins said as he shook Xavier's hand. "And good for Helena. The Wellington trial starts next week, and with your testimony, he'll be put away for a long time." "Justice will be served," Xavier agreed, his arm around Katherine's waist. "But tonight is for celebrating, not for talk of trials." Collins nodded, tipping his hat to Katherine. "Indeed it is." "Good night and congratulations again." When the last guest had gone, Katherine and Xavier returned to the veranda, now alone in the quiet spring night. The stars above them seemed especially brilliant, as if approving of the union celebrated beneath them. "What are you thinking?" Xavier asked, noting Katherine's contemplative expression. She smiled, leaning into his embrace. "I was thinking about journeys, how mine began with a dangerous road and an inheritance I never expected, and led me to you and a life I never could have imagined. Any regrets?" He asked, his voice teasing though a hint of genuine question remained. Katherine turned in his arms, rising on tiptoes to kiss him. "Not a single one," she assured him. "This is exactly where I'm meant to be." Xavier lifted her into his arms, making her laugh in surprise. "Then let's begin this journey properly, Mrs. Hawkins," he said, carrying her toward the house that was now their shared home. "Not until the stars fade?" Katherine asked, her eyes shining with happiness. "And far beyond," Xavier promised, sealing his words with a kiss as he carried his bride across the threshold and into their future together. 5 years later, Katherine stood on the same veranda, watching as Xavier taught their 4-year-old son Edward to ride his first pony. Little Eddie, as they called him, had his father's blue eyes and his mother's auburn hair, a perfect blend of them both. His giggles carried across the yard as Xavier led the gentle pony in a circle, one hand steadying the boy in the saddle. Nearby, 2-year-old Rose played with wooden blocks on a blanket, her dark curls bobbing as she concentrated on her tower. She was guarded by an aging but vigilant hound named Star, who had wandered onto the property shortly after their wedding and never left. Katherine rested a hand on her swelling abdomen, feeling the gentle kicks of the third Hawkins child due to arrive before winter. Their family was growing, as was the legacy Edward Blackwell had left them. The Blackwell Mining Company had prospered under Katherine's management, expanding to 2 additional sites while maintaining the high standards of safety and fair treatment her uncle had established. Xavier had eventually taken on a role in the company as well, overseeing security for all operations and serving as Katherine's most trusted advisor. Gregory Wellington had been convicted for his crimes and remained in prison, his mining operations sold to pay restitution to his workers and to the Blackwell Company. The rivalry that had nearly cost Katherine her life was now just another chapter in Helena's history. Katherine's father had visited twice more since the wedding, staying longer each time and developing a surprising bond with his grandchildren. He had even begun to talk of selling his Boston home and moving west permanently, a possibility that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago. "Mama, look," Eddie called, waving excitedly as Xavier allowed the pony to move at a slightly faster pace. "I'm riding like Papa, I see you, darling," Katherine called back, waving proudly. "You're doing wonderfully." Xavier looked up at her, his smile as warm and reassuring as it had been on that first day when he'd helped her from the overturned wagon. 5 years of marriage had added a few more lines to his face and more silver to his temples, but his blue eyes still held the same steadfast love that had captured her heart. As the afternoon sun began to lower toward the mountains, Xavier brought Eddie and the pony back to the house. He lifted the boy from the saddle, setting him down with exaggerated care. "Can I ride again tomorrow, Papa?" Eddie asked, bouncing with excitement. "If the weather's good," Xavier promised, ruffling the boy's hair. "Now go wash up for supper and help your sister with her blocks." As the children moved to the blanket where Rose was playing, Xavier climbed the steps to join Katherine on the veranda. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands coming to rest protectively over hers on her belly. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice soft in her ear. "Wonderful," she replied truthfully. "Happy." They stood together, watching their children play as the Montana evening settled around them. The life they had built together was not without challenges. Running a mining operation never was, but it was rich with love and purpose. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been the marshal who responded to that attack on my wagon?" Katherine asked, leaning back against her husband's solid chest. Xavier was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think we would have found each other somehow," he finally said. "Some things are meant to be, no matter what path you take to get there." Katherine turned in his arms, looking up into the face she had come to know as well as her own. "Like stars that never fade," Xavier smiled, bending to kiss her softly. "Exactly like that." Later that night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, they stood again on the veranda, continuing a tradition they had established on their first night together. No matter how busy their days, they always found time to stand beneath the stars, remembering the promise that had brought them together. "Not until the stars fade," Xavier whispered, his arm around Katherine's waist. "And far beyond," she completed, her head on his shoulder as they gazed up at the brilliant Montana sky, where stars stretched endlessly above them, eternal witnesses to a love that had begun with a chance encounter and grown into a legacy as enduring as the mountains themselves.